Hi, and welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this show, we talk about energy, politics, innovation, and energy, power, innovation, and politics in any order that you want to choose it. My guest is my friend Chris Keefer, who's the director of Doctors for Nuclear Energy. Chris, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Robert, it's a pleasure to be here. It was great having you on my podcast, the Decouple Podcast, and it's always a pleasure to chat.
Well, great. So you have many hats, but we'll get to those in a minute. But I warned you, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself. So if you don't mind, I've given your title, but assume you just arrived at a dinner party. You have 45 or 60 seconds to introduce yourself. Tell us who you are, please.
Sure. Yeah. So, I'm a Canadian emergency physician. Been practicing medicine for about 10 years. I've always had an advocate or activist bent to me. I've spent a lot of time working on issues around refugee healthcare and Indigenous health in Canada. I have a beautiful 2-year-old son who is kind of most of my world, but on my spare time when I'm not doctoring, I've become quite involved in this issue of advocacy around energy and climate and environment, and that's led me towards being a strong promoter of nuclear energy.
Gotcha. So what is Doctors for Nuclear Energy? I think it's a fairly new organization, is it not?
Yeah, it was founded by myself and English physician, Anton der Muri. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. It's a South African name. In November of 2018. And basically the impetus behind it was that there's a number of physician groups which have a very strong anti-nuclear bent to them. I'm sure most of your viewers will be familiar with Helen Caldicott, who's probably the most famous anti-nuclear physician, but also organizations that she's helped revive or found, Physicians for Social Responsibility, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, which really morphed from a concern with the abolition of nuclear weapons and a successful fight against atmospheric weapons testing towards opposition and fear mongering, especially around nuclear energy. And in my read of the scenario, if you look at the literature, especially surrounding nuclear accidents, the harm, again, these are from the high quality studies put out by the UN and national governments, large consensus based high quality evidence. The harms have to do with the psychological reactions to these accidents, rushed evacuations and stigma and things like that. And so these physicians, in my mind, to a degree, have blood on their hands in terms of the sort of fear mongering they engage with. And so I really wanted to create an organization that could demonstrate, and there are a number of pro-nuclear physicians. We have members from around the world, basically every continent on Earth. But as with many things on the sort of pro-nuclear side of the opinion spectrum, we failed to be organized and create a voice. And I think that's sort of what I've brought to the table with Doctors for Nuclear Energy, but also some of the other work that I do with similarly titled Canadians for Nuclear Energy. But we'll get into that, I'm sure.
So, right. So you're Doctors for Nuclear Energy, which is doctorsfornuclearenergy.org. There's Canadians for Nuclear Energy, which is c4ne.ca, if memory serves. And then you have the Decouple Podcast, and you're a medical doctor and do emergency. So it sounds like you don't have a lot of spare time. But
yeah, it's I was joking about this on another podcast recently, but emergency medicine is known as the hobbyist specialty, maybe kind of jokingly amongst some of my other colleagues. But it's a job where you show up at work and they've done some productivity studies where a guy follows you around with a checkboard, a checklist and looks at the time that you're spent on task versus talking around the water cooler or something like that. And emergency docs tend to be kind of on their feet, task oriented, something like 96% of the time. Anyway, you do your work, and you're really able to kind of leave it at work though, and that does give you the opportunity to pursue some things outside of work. I've noticed with my colleagues, and
sure.
I've just kind of taken it in my own direction.
Gotcha. So and you're working in a hospital in Toronto then?
That's right. Yeah.
And what can I mention the hospital, or you prefer not
No,
to?
you know what? I mean, as a physician, the hospitals, they hate it when we say
Okay,
where we
never mind.
work.
Never
So
mind.
no,
Okay.
I'll plead the fifth on that.
Okay, no problem. Well, so one of the things that's very interesting to me, and you mentioned what is it, Caldicott's organization, and she's has garnered a lot of attention and written a lot of things that are fear mongering around nuclear, and she's a physician. But the part that we've talked before about this is the importance of radiation in medicine. So you're a doctor. How often, when you're on a typical shift in the emergency room, how many times during that shift, or how many of your patients, or give me a metric about how often you're using radiation as part of your medical practice?
Yeah. So as an emergency physician, I'm dealing with undifferentiated pathology. I'm making diagnoses in patients that are coming in and haven't been assessed yet. And so, radiation in the form of medical diagnostics is a vital tool for me. So absolutely every shift I'm ordering X-rays or CT scans. It's hard to say, maybe 1 in 4 patients is getting some kind of either an X-ray or a CT scan. I'm not an oncologist, so I'm not administering radiotherapy in that regard. But in terms of investigations, that's huge. And I always talk about this because there's a real fear that people have around radiation. In North America, for instance, most of us get about 2.7 millisieverts of radiation. And what's interesting about that is,
and I want to stop you there.
yeah,
2.7 millisieverts. We used to talk REMS. Millisieverts is
right.
is
It's
the
very confusing, but millisieverts is an attempt to weight the different kinds of radiation, both based on the type of radiation. So, gamma versus alpha versus beta, whether that radiation is from an internal exposure, an external exposure, the tissues it's passing through. So there's sort of tissue weighting factor. So it's rather than just an absorbed dose, it's trying to look at the biological effect of that dose. But the very interesting point here is that of the amount of radiation that is kind of artificial, there's a lot of it that's just natural background, right? From cosmic rays, from radon gas, kind of escaping from granite rock formations, things like that. But the component that's artificial is about 15% of that pie chart, and 95% of that artificial component is medical.
So again, we're referring here to these 2.7 millisieverts,
Yeah,
and that's over what time period, Chris?
that's a yearly dose.
Okay, so
Yeah.
2.7 millisieverts per year for the average American or average Canadian.
Yeah.
And you're saying that the background radiation, or the background portion of that, is how much again?
So of the overall background dose, that 2.7 is just the dose that everyone is exposed to on average. Of that, 15% is artificial, and 14% is medical. So, if you're worried about nuclear accidents or fallout from weapons, we're down into 0.1, 0.01 amounts that are as a result of the things that we really fear. And, it's very interesting on a number of technologies. If you look at genetic engineering, if you look at nuclear, when the benefits accrue to an individual, we don't have fear of radiation or genetic engineering. If you're a diabetic, I mean, we have amazing processes with biotechnology to create insulins, which are very pure, right? We used to get insulin by grinding up, pork pancreases and trying to extract it. And there was all kinds of contaminants and problems with that. Now diabetics get amazing pure insulin as a result of genetically engineered yeast, right? You don't hear protests against that because the benefit is individual. And similarly, when I'm on shift and, if I have a little child that's had a bad fall and hit their head, I have to make the decision about whether to get a CT scan of their brain, right? And I'll have parents begging me to do that, right? To give basically a 2 millisievert dose to their child when that's the entire yearly background radiation. So there's no fear of radiation there. But when we start talking about technologies that have a collective benefit, so if we look at nuclear energy, which produces essentially zero emissions energy, with no air pollution, which is just huge, right? Because we know about 7 million people die every year as a consequence of air pollution. All of a sudden, those fears of radiation become really something that is something that really holds back the technology. And so I just think it's interesting, and maybe this kind of plays into ideas around sort of a sense of collective good or civic duty, which are very appealing to me. It's just a very interesting phenomenon that I find.
Well, that is interesting. I hadn't thought about that before, but this idea that there's a collective harm that might happen, but there's an individual good if you're going to help me diagnose my son who just fell off his bike, so that the radiation in that case will not really worried about that. And, I don't know anybody that has ever said, oh, I'm worried about the radiation I'm going to get from my X-ray or CT scan. But if there's an accident at Fukushima, I mean, I had a friend of mine who was saying, oh, well, get the iodine pills immediately. And he lives here in Texas. And I thought,
Right.
what are you talking about? But I want to return to that idea about because it's closely related to what you mentioned earlier. But the studies that have been done, the epidemiological studies after Fukushima, found that the health problems were caused by the evacuation, not the accident. So it's the point that I'm getting here is, or maybe I'll ask it in the form of a question. So is the fear of radiation more dangerous than the radiation?
Absolutely. And I mean, when we look
and
at
how crazy is that? I mean, that the fear is more destructive than the thing you fear. I mean, where else does that happen? I mean, I can't think of anything at the moment.
Yeah, I think there's examples. They're not at my fingertips right now. But again, this is, that might sound strange to people because people watch, the Chernobyl HBO drama series, and they get a certain impression. And at the end, what's quoted is, there's controversy about how many people died as a result of this accident, and the estimates range from, a 250,000 to very few. But
which is a total cop out, right? Well, doctors may, one set says this. And
but I mean, as physicians, and I think this is a real paradigm shift, and what gives me hope that newer physicians are going to look at the evidence and arrive at new conclusions, right? The basis of medical evidence used to be what was called a mechanistic, right? So, okay, I've got this enzyme which performs this function. If I block it with a drug, this should be the result. Therefore, this is the evidence, it works. And about 15 or 20 years ago, we moved into what we call an evidence-based medicine paradigm, where a mechanism wasn't sufficient, and we required epidemiologic data. So we need to do big, double-blinded, randomized controlled trials, trying to eliminate all of the other variables, test a very specific intervention, and that was the new standard of evidence. And so physicians have become much better trained at what we call critical appraisal of the literature, right? Looking at the quality of a study. And so when you look at the studies that have been done, say on Chernobyl, you have the UN Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, right? The UN, the Chernobyl Forum. This is 8 UN agencies collaborating with the 3 affected countries, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, hundreds of experts, consensus statements, right? And then you have these other reports, which are quoted by that HBO series, things like the Torch report, the other report on Chernobyl, or the Yablokov report. Both of these, the Torch report was actually funded by the European Green Party, right? I believe there's 3 authors on it. And they base their conclusions purely on this concept of the linear no threshold approach, and just kind of doing some fancy math. And okay, well, if it's this dose of radiation we apply to this many people, we're going to get this many cancers, right?
Right.
So it's very low quality evidence, and the bias is just built into it. There is certainly, if you're being funded by the European Green Party to do a report on Chernobyl, which scientists do you think they're gonna choose for this study, and what outcomes are they looking for?
Right. Well, and it's interesting, I had a guest on my podcast, and you may have spoken to her as well, Geraldine Thomas, was just really compelling in her discussions of Chernobyl, and she runs the Chernobyl Tissue Bank at Imperial College London. And she made some of the same points, that it was the fear of radiation, not the radiation, that was so deadly. But I think it's just it to me, it brings a different quality to the discussion when you approach it from a medical standpoint and saying, no, these radiation is essential for diagnostics, it's essential for treatment, and this is something that we should be embracing instead of pushing away or fearing. But let me follow up on that, because you made another good point, and it was on I think your March 26th Twitter feed, when you were talking about the the pro-nuclear petition that was written or read on the floor of the Parliament in Canada. But you made a reference there to this idea about radiation, and that we have to move past it, that that we need to embrace that. So you seem to be getting some traction with that, though. How do you feel? Well, I'm mixing two questions here. How successful do you think that petition was, and did it really move the ball in terms of where your campaign is involved now?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so just to introduce that petition, it's coming out of this new group, Canadians for Nuclear Energy. And that group grows out of a frustration, I think, with looking at the anti-nuclear groups and how loud their bark is. I mean, they represent a tiny fraction of the population, but because their arguments are based on an emotive appeal, and also because they've been very well funded, and historically we can see a lot of that funding coming from the fossil fuel industry, interestingly enough. They have a great ground game. They're experienced campaigners, right? And so Canadians for Nuclear Energy is, this grassroots effort by folks, honestly, without a lot of advocacy experience, that are, exploring ways in which to organize the pro-nuclear side of the spectrum, simply so that we can have a balanced debate and hopefully shift the Overton window towards more of a science and evidence-based approach, and embrace things like.
Let me interrupt you, because the Overton window is something that another guest on the podcast used. What is the Overton window?
So the Overton window is basically what acceptable political discourse is, right? So if you want to look at the Overton window in the US, we could say that, since the 1950s, it's really moved a lot to the right, right? So, even progressive Democrats now are, if you look at the politics of, say, Eisenhower, this was a guy who favored fairly high tax rates, for instance, right, as a way to incentivize corporations to spend their money so that it wouldn't get taxed and invest in the economy, et cetera, right? That would now be a Bernie Sanders idea. So the Overton window has shifted far to the right in the US.
I see.
That would be an example.
This is the idea of what is acceptable discourse. And so
exactly
the cancel culture is trying to move things out of the Overton window. Is that
or just shift the Overton window to, again, what's acceptable to be spoken about, or the discourse, right?
So I'm interrupting you again. I'm sorry here, but I remembered what the part that you said in the Twitter presentation you made. It was about the importance of radiation and radioisotopes coming from nuclear reactors in Canada being used to sterilize PPE, which I hadn't heard of before.
This is an incredible story.
Tell me about that, because that was something else that came out of that. A great opportunity for you, but I'd never heard that. So tell me, what was it? Cobalt? What was the what?
Yeah. So Canada's got a pretty extraordinary history in terms of nuclear research. After the Second World War, we were the second largest research center in the world. Think about this little country, probably of, at that point, I'm not sure, 15, 20 million Canucks up here, running this breakthrough technology and making a lot of important discoveries. And so we developed this heavy water moderated reactor that uses natural uranium, doesn't require any enrichment because we weren't interested in weapons, and that could use, rather than needing a heavy forging industry, which is we're only sort of capable of that in a few countries around the world, could create a design that didn't require that. And basically, because of it being heavy water moderated, it lends itself very well to, I guess, kind of like cooking isotopes. So we can take cobalt, naturally occurring cobalt, and park it in our reactor for a little while, let it absorb some neutrons, and we can pull out cobalt-60, which is a really strong gamma emitter. And that is used, and because, again, of this unique reactor design, we are one of the world's top producers, even though we're such a small country, of cobalt-60. And indeed, we produce enough cobalt-60 to sterilize 20 billion pieces of PPE every year.
That was the number that I was after. And so
20 billion.
This is the
40% of the world's single-use surgical instruments are sterilized with Canadian cobalt-60.
Say that again, because that's a really interesting. I haven't heard this.
40% of the world's single-use surgical instruments are sterilized with Canadian cobalt-60. So I have this saying, Robert, where it's, I like my climate cool, my air clean, and my surgical instruments sterile. And those are my big arguments for nuclear.
The air clean. Say it again. The air clean.
My climate cool, my air clean, and my surgical instruments sterile.
Got it. Nice. That's good.
So you were asking earlier.
Go ahead.
You were asking earlier if this petition didn't have a big impact, yes or no. And these are early days. There's really not been any grassroots led nuclear advocacy. I think people are very surprised by the very existence of that, or that there are citizens that would put their energies into this. So it's early days. And really, in terms of my tactical and strategic thinking, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can look at the campaigns that are being run by the anti-nuclear groups and lift the best things. And so it was just, I saw that they'd put an anti-nuclear petition in. I didn't know there was this mechanism that existed, but in Commonwealth countries, you can find a sponsoring MP, and as long as you get a requisite number of signatures, that petition will get read on the floor of the House of Commons, which would be the equivalent, I guess, of your House of Representatives, right?
Right.
So it's an incredible opportunity for citizens to participate in the democratic process. And I mean, I wasn't sure I was going to find a sponsor for this petition because the language is bold. I mean, one of the lines is that nuclear energy is the most environmentally friendly form of energy generation, requiring a tiny fraction of the mining, processing, and infrastructure, for instance, right?
Yeah.
And, having a politician read that in our current context, which is, politicians are very, very nervous about engaging with nuclear energy, certainly existing nuclear energy as well, right? We can talk about the advanced kind of imaginary stuff that doesn't yet exist. And, as part of a branding exercise that can sort of maybe help politicians distance themselves from this, this political football. But, I think it was relevant that the petition got 6,000 signatures. We really are trying to mobilize a base, and a big part of that base are people that work in the sector. Canada has 60,000 nuclear workers, throughout our supply chain. We are one of the largest uranium producers in the world. We have around 20 reactors in the country, some reactors around the world. And these are workers in the sector. They understand radiation. They have a more realistic sense of it. They understand the collective benefits of nuclear energy. But they haven't been mobilized. A lot of workers in the sector, in fact, have been very much stigmatized for doing what they do. And to me, that's just bizarre, because for me, nuclear energy workers are climate and clean air, and let's even say medical heroes. You can't have a modern functioning medical system without sterile equipment, right? And you can't put everything in an autoclave.
Yeah, I like that idea. Climate, clean air, and medical heroes. But those are parts of what the other part that seems to me the big difference that I see, and I want your thoughts on this, is that the Canadian nuclear sector is much more cohesive than the American one. Mm-hmm. And that's in part due to the fact that some of the Canadian, you have the Canadian pension funds that are invested in a lot of the nuclear industry in Canada. Can you explain that for me?
Yeah, I mean, so absolutely. And it's very interesting. I mean, there's a little example maybe of American exceptionalism here, although I'm probably misusing the term, but I think it is exceptional that a nuclear industry is as privately owned and run as it is in the States.
Right.
And that's had certain implications. And that was a struggle, right? I mean, under Eisenhower, there were a number of thinkers who were saying, listen, we don't want an atomic TVA. This is a battleground. We've been in the New Deal now. We've had 20 years of democratically controlled government. It's time for the private sector to take something over and maybe in generous terms, take some of the budgetary, the debt off of the government, balance the budget by making this a privately funded thing. But that had consequences. And I think, I'm not an expert at this, but in looking at it, there's this funny saying that America has 100 different types of reactors and 3 kinds of cheese, whereas France has 3 kinds of reactors and 100 types of cheese, probably 500. Who knows, right?
Yeah, right.
But I think that's a result of this. And you have a lot of reactor sites that are single or double reactor sites in the States. And something that's very different about Ontario in particular is that, we had the Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, which collaborated with Ontario Hydro, a public utility, so federally, publicly owned entity, and a provincial one, a little bit of cooperation from General Electric Canada on some certain parts. And we ended up building these enormous multi-unit plants, right, which take advantage of economies of scale and economy of multiples even. So we have, 2 nuclear plants, one of which, until I think China built a larger collection of reactors on one site, was the largest nuclear plant in the world here in Ontario.
And that was that was Bruce Power, is that
Bruce
right?
Power? It still is, yeah. 6.3. I think they're going to try and push 7 gigawatts of production from one site. Right,
which is just
8 CANDU units.
So 7 gigawatts, 7,000 megawatts. I mean, that's an enormous plant.
And our other 2 plants are, they were built as a 4 gigawatt plant. Pickering, it's now running at about 3.2, and then Darlington is a 4-unit plant that's around 3.5. So these are large plants. They were publicly financed, and as a result, we were thinking about how do we do this efficiently and cheaply. Well, we build a whole bunch of reactors in series on the same site. Right, we learned from the one we just built on the next one, and we can localize our transmission infrastructure. So it's just a model that I think would not lend itself well to the American model per se, where there's, I think, there's more competition, which is maybe a good thing in certain market sectors. But I think you've started to explore this as well with energy. There's not a true market. There's a lot of distortion, subsidies, et cetera. And if you have something strategic like nuclear energy, which, I really liken to, when I'm thinking about renewables and nuclear, my latest kind of analogy, and I'm borrowing part of it from Meredith Angwin, but I think developing it a little bit further, is that, nuclear is like this enormous freight train, right? And what we care about is we're trying to move this, low air pollution, carbon-free payload of energy, down the line. And it takes a long time to build this freight train. It takes a lot of momentum to get a nuclear program going, to get the supply chain greased so that we get costs down. But once that train starts moving, there's nothing like it.
Right.
And then you have the renewables, which are, to me, like little bikes with panniers on them. You can build a lot of them really fast. They're easy to finance privately, right? You have a quick return on investment. There's lots of subsidies for them. But, the rider gets tired, has to get off, has to sleep at night. Some days doesn't really feel like riding, right? So
that's funny. I like this idea that reactors are freight trains and wind and solar are tandem bicycles. I kind of like that idea. But I think that your point here about the government involvement is really a key one, as well as this idea of and we talked some months ago, and since we talked, I think in February, I've been blacked out here in Austin.
Yeah.
And it changed I don't want to, well, I've used this word radicalized, and I think it has radicalized me. And that what is the fundamental problem? And it goes back to your point about the government involvement, which is this, that the politicians who set up this market for electricity in Texas thought that they're selling a commodity like hamburgers or tortillas. No, dumbass. This is not a commodity. This is an essential service. And it was a misunderstanding of what electricity is and what it means for the society. And that's kind of a long introduction to the point of, no, the electric grid is the single most important network in our society. So yes, it is right that the government is involved and takes a central role. And the Canadians have taken that central role and focus that on the nuclear sector, which I think is really key, because in the United States, there's no center of gravity for the nuclear sector in the United States. And that's one reason why it's failing so badly now.
Yeah. I mean, I'll correct you on that. Ontario we have, which is the most populous province, right? And I kind of lovingly refer to Ontario as the France of North America. We're about 63% nuclear. France is 75. We were a sort of government-led initiative. We built kind of one reactor type at sort of 3 different sizes. So very much kind of mirroring the French. The rest of the country, in terms of the clean provinces like British Columbia, Manitoba, Quebec, we have amazing hydro resources, right? So they're doing great on that regard. But if you are a province that's not blessed with enormous hydro reservoirs, and we have several of those that are dependent heavily on coal and on gas and other fossil fuels, nuclear, as we've shown in Ontario, is the way to get through that. And, unfortunately, things aren't quite as rosy as you're painting, because that's all at threat of eroding away. Because Ontario, again, the France of North America, in around 2008, 2009, embarked on an effort to become the Germany of North America, and very much imported a lot of ideas from the German Energiewende. And this idea that we could, create a renewables industry that would create 50,000 jobs and, would.
Yes. Jobs. We're going to create jobs by getting. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
This is the same.
And that was struck down by a WTO decision, which said, no, you can't have this kind of protectionist legislation. So of course, we're importing Chinese solar panels and German wind turbines and things like that. I mean, the whole thing's been a real disaster, and it's done, this enormous investment. And I think it's around, at this point, we gave out these 20-year juicy contracts. The government, again, this is this thing where we used to finance big infrastructure projects, and the government's very shy to do that now because of concerns around debt, even though interest rates are at historic lows. But rather than actually footing the bill and the government or the public paying for these wind and solar installations, what we said is, we're going to subsidize private industry to do it. It won't go on the government books. We'll just offload that on the ratepayer. Right. So these 20-year contracts were put in place, for solar to get 44 cents per kilowatt hour, right? For wind to get something around 21 cents locked in for 20 years, and getting paid for all the power you put on the grid, regardless of if it's useful. Right. So for instance, we have the lake effect here in Ontario. Our wind resources are very productive in the spring and the fall. That's actually when our demand is lowest, because we don't have a ton of heating and cooling to do at that time. And it blows more at night. So it's completely out of phase with demand. And what we used to do is we, in the very early days of the Green Energy Act, we used to say, okay, these renewables are great, they're virtuous, we're going to give them first access to the grid. And so they'd knock a nuclear plant offline. And nuclear, again, that freight train, you shut it down, it takes about 3 days to get it going again. And in the meantime, wind and sun would die off. And what do you need to do? You need to firm that with gas. So we'd burn a whole bunch of gas. So in the early days, before we said, no, nuclear and hydro get first on the grid, we were actually, emissions were going up, and we were spending a lot more money on natural gas. We ended up saving about $200 million a year on natural gas when we said, no, wind, you're a marginal source. You can be added on when we need you. We curtail it about 25% of the time. And we subsidize hydro bills in Michigan and New York State, because we end up exporting
the power
at a price that's much lower than the cost of production. And I've actually heard of this as a kind of ransom payment, because the Ohio Valley, there's a lot of coal in that area.
Right.
And the wind patterns tend to blow that up into Ontario. So to kind of pay for our clean air, I mean, this is kind of a joke, right? But we almost give away this almost free electricity, which, curtails some coal production in the Ohio Valley. It's a bit of a joke, but it's an interesting phenomenon.
Well, and let me follow up on that Green Energy Act, because I mean, it's had big political repercussions, right? For the McGuinty government, right? They were the big promoters of this, and people saw their hydro bills, their utility bills skyrocketing, and they went from the incumbent political dominating the provincial government to being a rump party, replaced by Ford as your new premier, right?
Yeah.
But he ran in part, as I understand it, on these issues about electricity affordability, which is truly remarkable when you think about it in terms of this important public commodity that he's saying, no, the government messed this all up. And it was in part because of this embrace of renewables. Is my history right on this?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, there was another premier kind of in the mix. The Liberals are sort of thought of as the kind of natural governing party in Canada, and the Conservatives occasionally get in and shift the agenda slightly. But yeah, I think it was a big part of that. And I mean, there's not a lot of Ontarians, for instance, that heat with electricity, but those that did, I mean, they were just crushed by these electricity prices. And we have to understand that, your energy costs, when they go up, that's a highly socially regressive policy.
Sure.
Because, as someone with a lower income, a greater amount of your disposable income goes into your energy costs. And so really it punishes the poor. And I think that was part of the backlash. It's a little more complicated than that, but certainly, I mean, for me, this whole issue of the Green Energy Act is personal, because in Ontario, we really leapfrogged. We talk about this progression sometimes in terms of energy density from, biomass to coal to natural gas to nuclear. And we just jumped right over natural gas, really, because we had 25% of our electricity was from coal. And we managed to start up 6 CANDU reactors, which provided 90% of the energy to phase out coal. It was called North America's greatest greenhouse gas emissions reduction. And, that was an amazing accomplishment. But with the Green Energy Act, we decided to spend $30 or $40 billion on these renewables contracts, again, for energy that really is often not useful, gets curtailed, gets given away for free, has done almost nothing to reduce our emissions any further, rather than maintaining and refurbishing one of our key nuclear plants. And these are big plants, right? 3.2 gigawatts, the Pickering plant, right? Which was built instead of a coal plant in the 1970s, by the way. But because of that choice, we're going to lose that Pickering nuclear power station. We're going to lose that 3.2 gigawatts of air pollution free, zero emissions electricity, which really powers the city I live in. Canada's biggest city is essentially powered by Pickering on 1.2 square kilometers of land or something. And because of this foolish investment in renewables, we're taking a massive step backwards, both in terms of, I'm very climate concerned, both in terms of being a climate leader, right? Something like 40 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, we're going to jump up into the 150s, 160s, but also in terms of a very personal issue for me as a physician in terms of air quality, right? We're going to be burning a lot of natural gas, right? And better than coal, but still you get a lot of nitrous oxides and other, contributors to smog. And we saw enormous health benefits when we got rid of coal. And for me, you got to keep working up that energy density ladder. And it's a real shame to be going in the wrong direction.
I completely agree. I didn't realize it was 1.2 square kilometers. So at 3.2 gigawatts, we're talking power density of something on the order of 3,000 watts per square meter, which is among the highest that I know of. I know the Indian Point reactor before they closed Unit 2 was about 2,000 watts. But I mean, it's just that, but it leads to this issue of land use, which I want to talk about just a little bit as well.
Yeah.
Because in Ontario, you had a huge backlash, rural backlash against the encroachment of big wind. And you had something like 100 communities say, we are not willing to host wind projects. But it goes back to the secondary part of that is Lee Cordner, who's been on the Power Hungry podcast a couple times. He said, yeah, okay, you build new generation. Where are you going to put it? How are you going to connect it? And how are you going to pay for it? And the connecting part is the thing that is increasingly clear to me about the transmission issue. That the great benefit of nuclear is you can use and in the future, looking at where to locate it, use the existing transmission grid, because that's the other part of this that is the Achilles heel for the renewables is the best resources are far from the cities where the demand is. Are you seeing similar?
No, absolutely. I mean,
is it a similar dynamic in Canada?
Yeah, I just interviewed Mike Conley, who did probably the definitive takedown of Mark C. Jacobson's, the Solutions Project, their roadmaps to 100% renewable energy. And I mean, we're talking about fuel-less systems in terms of these wind and solar systems. And it's a complete paradigm shift, because what we're used to doing is getting fuel, bringing it close to population centers, doing it in a power plant there, having, an efficient transmission infrastructure that brings that to the load centers. And there we go, right? But with wind and solar, you have to build it where the resources are the best, which is often quite far away from population centers. I believe you guys in Texas spent on the order of $5 billion to hook up all that transmission to bring it to your load centers in Dallas and Austin. So right. there's this huge shift. And in Ontario, it's very interesting because our premier anti-nuclear organization is ironically called the Ontario Clean Air Alliance, and they are vociferously anti-nuclear, despite the fact that nuclear produces zero air pollution, right? And their proposed solution is to build tons of wind and solar, which again, the wind particularly will produce out of phase with demand. And then we're going to try and bring hydropower from Quebec, which has enormous hydro resources, quite far away, I'll say, about 1,000 kilometers to the northeast.
Right.
So build the transmission infrastructure to bring that down, become completely independent on those climate and air issue that respects national boundaries. So at present, that Quebec hydropower, it goes down and it displaces coal and gas in New England and some of the neighboring provinces, right?
So let me interrupt you there, because I had a little latency issue there. I don't know why, but let me ask that question again, because I've been checking my speed and it seems like it's fine. But let me ask you about put the question to you. So
it's me, Rob. 1 second. It was me. Here, give me 1 second.
Okay.
I hope that hasn't screwed up anything else. I think so far everything's been good. Okay, I'm on my better network now. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, we've had just a couple of latency hits, and I didn't want to interrupt. But so, let me ask this about. Okay, so new question. Quebec has a lot of hydro, and there's been talk, and I've followed it in New York for nearly 40 years about bringing Canadian hydro into the northeastern U.S. So tell me about what's going on with Canadian hydro and this idea about bringing hydro from Quebec into Ontario. Where is that? What's the status on that discussion?
Yeah, I mean, so this strategy is parroted a lot by one of Ontario's premier anti-nuclear organizations, the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. And their plan is to build yet more renewables, which so far have proven to be very out of sync with demand patterns, and back those up using hydro as a battery. And I think you'll hear about this from a lot of renewables advocates, that this is, one of the ways to deal with the intermittency issue. But, Quebec does have incredible hydro resources and a surplus many times of the year. Interestingly, they heat mostly with hydro in the winter. And so their peak demand is January, February. If you know anything about Quebec, it's -40 in some of these places, right? So they have a huge upsurge in their demand, and they actually don't export very much. They actually import some energy from Ontario at that time. But all that aside, the plan is to build an enormous transmission infrastructure from northern Quebec, where these hydro dams are, bring these interties all the way into Ontario, phase out our nuclear, become completely dependent on a province that, as recently as 20 years ago, tried to secede from the nation. and the issue again is that climate and air pollution don't respect national boundaries, right? So right now that hydro is going to New England, it's going to New Brunswick, it's displacing coal and gas. it's decreasing carbon emissions and decreasing air pollution. So why on earth would you take an ultra low non-air polluting source in Quebec and use that to get rid of a ultra low emissions non-air polluting source in Ontario? It makes zero sense. It's just an ideological commitment and hatred of nuclear energy, which is puzzling for a group that's ostensibly about clean air, and ironically up until about 2011 took a large chunk of their funding from natural gas companies.
Well, but the key there is that distance, and that's the part that to me is really the key here. Is it goes back to the land use problem, and you're going to build 1,000 kilometers of high voltage transmission. It's deeply unpopular. Nobody wants those high voltage transmission lines on their land, and so the idea that and you mentioned Meredith Angwin earlier, and I think one of her great insights was her point on this, the fatal trifecta. Too much reliance on intermittent renewables, too much reliance on on just-in-time natural gas, and too much reliance on imports. And I think that's the key here in terms of it. I mean, I think we even saw it in Texas with these CREZ lines, right? Oh, we're going to bring renewables in from a few hundred miles away. No. To your earlier point, you want the generation as close to the load center as you can make it, because it means better reliability.
And very interestingly, I mean, you'll see the arguments just flip-flop back and forth to suit the anti-nuclear agenda. For instance, the Ontario Clean Air Alliance in 2011, they were building a series of gas plants, which will back up these renewable sources if we lose nuclear, right? And that's what's going to happen as Pickering shuts. We're going to bring 3 gigawatts of gas online. But at that point, they were saying there were protests against these gas plants being built in urban centers. And the chairman of the Clean Air Alliance, Jack Gibbons, actually went to one of these communities and said, no, you shouldn't oppose this natural gas plant that's getting built about 800 meters from your subdivision, because it's important, it's environmentally friendly to build the power sources close to where the demand is. So that was the argument 10 years ago. And now they're saying, no, we don't like gas anymore. We want to bring hydro in from 1,000 kilometers away in northern Quebec. And it's just it's insane. And it's all about this creation of a Rube Goldberg machine, which is these 100% renewables fantasies that rely on far-flung production, intertying it all with these connectors. And as my friend Mike Conley was saying in this roadmap to nowhere, even if you follow things like Mark C. Jacobson's plan, you're not going to know if it works until it's about 80 or 90% built, right? Because it requires all this reliance on these interties and these interconnectors. So, it's very frustrating to me as well. As my role as president of Canadians for Nuclear Energy, I'm having the opportunity to speak with a number of political figures, and the degree of energy illiteracy is really astounding. And I have this joke. I think it was from the Spider-Man movie. Peter Parker said, "With great power comes great responsibility."
Right.
And these are politicians talking about an energy transition. Like, what's more consequential than that? And they're horribly undereducated on issues of energy. And they'll quote things, as articles of faith, like Mark C. Jacobson's roadmap. They've never read the goddamn thing. They haven't looked at any critical analysis, but it's a convenient thing that backs up their position.
Yeah.
It suits their cognitive biases. And so, yeah, that's okay. And I mean, that's just such a symptom of what's wrong, in terms of the way that we process information in the modern world now, where it's just kind of clickbait. Oh, that sounds good. I agree with that. But if that's government policy, informing government policy, and you believe in the urgency of climate change, and we have X many years, if we fuck this up and we make the wrong technological choices, and the whole Rube Goldberg machine ends up falling to pieces, you've squandered 20, 30 years. And you've squandered all the mining, the resources, the political will to do something about it. I mean, it is stunning. And that idea that I want to come back to the idea of complexity, but the idea around your point about these politicians promoting ideas. And you mentioned Bernie Sanders earlier. So, okay, Bernie, you're from Vermont. There is the wind energy in Vermont is so unpopular that you can't build wind energy in the state of Vermont. And yet in 2016, he came out fully in favor of Dr. Mark Jacobson's from Stanford, his whole all renewable portfolio, or his scenario. But there was no understanding, again, of the importance of the grid. The electric grid is the foundation of society. So these ideas about replacing a simple system with a more complex one is the same thing we've seen here in Texas, where you look at what happened with the ERCOT market and how the ERCOT market functions. It is incredibly complicated.
And now what we're finding in the wake of the blackouts, well, the buck doesn't stop anywhere. No, oh, well, who's to blame? Well, don't blame me. Oh, well, I got paid, you didn't get paid. And now the litigation is going on, and it's going to last for years because it's not clear who got the money, where the money went. There's no one responsible because they created a system with so much complexity that no one really understands it. And no one wants to take responsibility for it. So it goes back to this idea, in my view, and I'm curious what your thought is, but the government and the policymakers' misunderstanding of what electricity is. And that this idea of it's not a commodity, it's a service, and it's the most critical service. I mean, does that ring true to you? How do you think about just the perception of the energy itself that's delivered, right? But it's not energy we're after, it's power.
I mean, I might think differently if, my job was running a video games arcade or something about the life-saving importance of energy, but I'm a doctor. I work in a hospital, right? My ventilators need reliability, and we have a whole bunch of diesel generators in case the grid goes down, right?
Sure.
But we don't want that to go down. And if it went down like it did in Texas, we're going to run out of diesel for those generators, right?
Sure.
And Texas could have been even more of a house of cards, and it will become more of a house of cards, I understand, if another $60 billion is spent on just wind and gas, and you don't firm things up with something like nuclear. You mentioned Bernie Sanders, and this is something that I find truly puzzling, is, progressive politicians that care about progressive taxation, that care about, the quality of public services, are so opposed to nuclear. I mean, Bernie Sanders from Vermont on record, supporting the closure of Vermont Yankee, the loss of several hundred, I think 400 or 500 union jobs. Emissions went up after Vermont Yankee was closed. But, the issue is, I think of the grid as, I think I've said this before to you, I think of the grid as a commons, right? And an attack on the grid, a fragilization of the grid upon which we all depend. You've called it the network of networks, right? That's an attack on everybody. An attack on one is an attack on all. And as we've been talking about, high energy prices punish the poor more. And when we look at a lot of the renewable developments, I mean, there's this idea that's very popular amongst maybe Bernie Sanders followers that, hey, because a wind turbine and a solar panel, I mean, they feel natural, but also they're at a scale that's understandable, right? I could pop one on my roof, I could put one in my backyard. A community could control this, we could have we could democratize energy, but it very much fits into this kind of small is beautiful, off the grid, what I call kind of an electrically gated community, right? And that's what we really see in a lot of these sort of very eco-conscious things. We're going off grid. We built this nice little energy efficient community. Screw the poor, screw anyone who can't afford this. But all the incentives are there for instance, in Ontario with our feed-in tariffs, if you're wealthy enough to take out a big loan and put a bunch of solar panels on your house and get paid 44 cents per kilowatt hour, you're being subsidized by, our economically disadvantaged average ratepayer. This is a fundamental issue of social injustice. And there's, another one is, I talk about the, you privatize the profits and socialize the costs. So yes, solar panels are getting cheaper, wind turbines are getting cheaper. That's pretty amazing what can happen when you scale these things up and you have government support and subsidies, et cetera, right? That can happen with nuclear, I hope. But, the issue is that the individual farms are cheap and the investors, pay to build the farm, but they don't have to pay the grid integration costs, exactly. Right? They don't pay for the crest line. The ratepayer does.
Right.
So you're these, and that's the thing where, because renewables are really sort of off limits, especially on the left, for any kind of criticism,
right?
These sort of discourses are not developing. So I think people are familiar with ideas like land footprint, the material intensity, the amount of mining that needs to occur for these weather harvesters.
Right.
But, I didn't start thinking about these ideas of, the grid as a commons, of, privatize the profits, socialize the cost, these social justice issues that our energy choices are making, until I had the courage to say, you know what, I don't care if you call me a basher or a bro. I'm respectful in how I talk to people. I'm intellectually curious. I'm gonna chase this one down and really seek to understand it. And these are some of the arguments that I've had success with, talking with some people on the left, some people, I guess your equivalent of Democrats are New Democratic Party that we have up here in Canada.
Right. But to interrupt, so that you're saying the success is on the regressive nature of the policies then? Yeah. Because I think I agree with you that I think that is what I've found in the last few months, and particularly since the blackouts, and looking at the regressive effect of these renewable mandates. and electric vehicle subsidies. A lot of these things, these are people, these are policies that are going to hurt the poor and the middle class.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too, after the blackouts, how the marketing of solar and battery systems has increased because, well, you can't depend on the grid. Well, then buy solar and a bunch of, Tesla Powerwalls. Okay, well, the barista at Starbucks doesn't have the 25 or 30 or 40 large that's going to be required to have that grid independence, as to your point. So it's the reliability and affordability go hand in hand.
And how libertarian is that? I mean, these are values that should be so foreign,
almost kind of Darwinian almost.
Yeah, I mean, these are values that should be so foreign from the likes of AOC and Bernie Sanders if their politics were consistent, right? But I think they haven't thought it through, to be honest. And hopefully, again, because the discourse on this is so undeveloped, because on the political left, even in the political center, it is taboo, it is heretical to talk critically about renewables. I mean, I'm a guy certainly on the left side of the spectrum. I'm a social democrat. And, if I want to think critically about renewables, I've got to go to, say, Mark P. Mills of the Manhattan Institute, someone I'm not politically aligned with at all, but, someone with a lot of engineering and science expertise, a physicist who can crunch the numbers and talk about things like, the Betz effect, the theoretical limits, the fact that, wind and solar are not going to follow the same curve as, Moore's law does with electronic chips.
Right.
This should be common knowledge. And let me just say this. I mean, if wind and solar threatened fossil fuels in any way, trust me, the discourse would be entirely different. Right? Meredith Angwin's talked about this.
How do you mean? What you follow?
Well, Meredith Angwin talks about this. For every megawatt of installed capacity of wind and solar that you put on the grid, generally speaking, you need to put something like 1.1 megawatts of a backup.
Right.
And for all intents and purposes, that's natural gas. I mean, we can have all kinds of hopeful fantasies that one day there's going to be a breakthrough battery technology. Right. Which will, it's not an energy source. It's an energy, it's stored energy, yeah. Right.
Right.
But because, you'll see advertisements all over the place, from, BP Beyond Petroleum about their renewable energy investment and how it pairs naturally with natural gas, the ideal partner for renewables. And it really is. But as Meredith talks about, this creates this fragile grid of just-in-time gas and intermittent, unreliable renewables. So like I said, I mean, nuclear threatens fossil fuels. When a nuclear plant closes, who benefits? I mean, it's natural gas that's replacing that output.
In almost every case.
There is certainly an interest in seeing these plants close. And I think that's why you see a lot of fossil fuel funding having made its way into the environmental movement, and particularly their anti-nuclear efforts.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because the one that pops in my head is the Sierra Club, of course, which took, I don't know, it was $25 or $30 million from Chesapeake Energy, the natural gas industry. And then they became under fire. Oh, well, we didn't mean it. And and now they're leading this electrify everything and the anti-nuclear effort, as well as the Natural Resources Defense Council and some others. But I really like your idea too, and maybe it's your term, but this fragilization of the grid, and the grid as the commons. And that we've seen, as you said, socialize the cost, privatize the profits. That's the American way, believe me. But that's definitely what happened here in Texas, where we had $66 billion spent on solar and wind in the years before the blackouts. And then immediately after, to your point as well, oh, don't blame wind and solar. Nobody expected them to perform. They, well, nobody expected them to perform. Well, why did we spend $66 billion on them then, when the grid was on the verge of collapse and was effectively worth nothing? But let me go back to one of the things that's you had on the website for Canadians for Nuclear Energy. I want to just shift gears. You quote Rudolph Virgo, whose name was not familiar to me, and he said something very interesting. I'd like the quote, which I'd never seen before. Medicine is a social science, and politics is nothing else but medicine on a large scale. So if politics is medicine on a large scale, our politicians are misapprehending or misdiagnosing the need for this critical network, right? The mother network, right? But let me ask you, well, so who is Virchow, and why that quote, why did you use it? Why is that on the Canadians for Nuclear Energy website?
I think it's actually it must be on the Doctors for Nuclear Energy website.
Oh, maybe it's on the Doctors. Okay.
Yeah, that makes more sense now. I was scratching my head for a second.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Rudolph Virgo is kind of known as the kind of grandfather, the godfather of public health. So he was sent up by it was to Upper Silesia to, I think, investigate a typhoid or a TB epidemic And he was a renowned pathologist and clinician. He discovered a lot of core concepts around thrombosis, for instance. And I think the government of the time expected him to come back and talk about the microorganisms at play. And he came back and he said, the reason there's an outbreak there is because people are dirt poor, because their housing sucks, because they're on starvation wages, right? Which was not a welcome conclusion by the government. And, when we think about medicine, we're trained not just to see the patient in front of us, but to think about the upstream causes of their disease, because there are these things called social determinants of health, right? And so I think that's what he was referring to, and that's what I'm kind of trying to draw on in terms of, and that's, to be honest, that's why Helen Caldicott does what she does, or that's why Physicians for Social Responsibility did what they did. They were concerned about, nuclear annihilation from an all-out nuclear war between the Soviets and the US. That's a valid fear, and they said that's a real upstream health consequence, right? I mean, all the thermal and burns and the radiation fallout would be the health problems we'd be dealing with, but let's try and deal with that upstream issue. And I'm making that argument now that, listen, air pollution is a major determinant of health. 7 million people, the WHO estimates, die every year as a result of air pollution. And that's not to say that people that are crippled by it, right? If you're a child growing up in Delhi, India, for instance, when we do pulmonary function tests on you, your lung capacity is going to be maybe 50, 60% of what it should be.
Right.
There's deaths and there's disability. So that's what I'm drawing on there, in terms of Rudolph Virgow's concepts.
Yeah, I just thought that was an interesting, just an interesting quote to think about medicine as this being a social science. And
yeah.
But again, it goes back to this idea about, well, where are we going to go? And will this fragilization of the grid continue, with the costs then being absorbed most definitely by the low and the middle income people? And that was something that some of the surveys, in fact, I had Dana Harmon from the Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute on the podcast recently, and she talked about the blackout and how low income people, fared during the blackout, and many of them lost power, but they didn't lose their natural gas connection, most of them. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so that fuel diversity became an issue about, well, social equity, right? And that, keeping, having people have some access to some reliable energy. So let's talk for a minute about the Decouple podcast, because now we're both doing a podcast. Why did you start it, and what's your aim with the podcast?
So you just broke up for a second, but you were asking about the Decouple podcast.
Yeah. For some reason, we're getting another latency hit.
Yeah, I think our connection's going haywire. Let's take a brief. I'm on the right network. I'm sure you sound like you're wired in, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm getting solid speeds on my end, but what were we talking about? Oh, the Decouple.
Yeah, all
podcast.
Of a sudden you're breaking up like crazy. Yeah. Sorry, you broke up again. I missed that. I think I know what you're asking, but
okay.
Can you just ask it one more time?
Let me ask it again. So you're the host of the Decouple podcast. Tell me about your aim. Why are you doing the podcast, and who do you have on there?
I mean, partially it's a selfish project. In college, I had a radio show, and I've always been a very curious person, and I love talking to smart people. And so I would, read a book, and it gave me this incredible excuse to call someone up and have this really incredibly intimate conversation for an hour. It's not a lot of opportunities or vehicles in life to do that. And so, I spent about 2 or 3 years really reading deeply about climate change, the environment, thinking about energy. At some point I decided I wanted to get more involved in the debate. And I was really struck by this idea of decoupling, which comes out of the eco-modernist. A couple of very different competing narratives in terms of how we deal with environmental problems. And one is this sort of Judeo-Christian blueprint of by eating the apple of knowledge in the Garden of Eden, we're expelled into this cruel world, and we've kind of sinned, by industrializing, and now we need to atone for those sins and go back to this, forgotten paradise, right? And that involves kind of harmonizing with nature and trying to deindustrialize, essentially, which has enormous impacts, right? I mean, if we were to go back and do natural things like burn our forests down for fuel, the environmental impacts would be horrible. And on the eco-modernist side, you have this idea that, hey, we're humanists and environmentalists. We can continue to allow humanity to flourish with plentiful energy, food, etc., technology, but we need to pursue the technology strategically that can ecologically decouple us so we can have that human prosperity without environmental degradation. And so that leads you towards technologies that can intensify human activities, right? So you can do more intensive farming on less land and rewild and spare nature, right? Or you can produce energy with a much lower footprint without air pollution, without altering the climate. And so nuclear is really, I think, that because of the energy density, right, just because of this quantum leap moving from combustion to fission, I've tended to focus a lot on that, not exclusively, but that has been a real theme on the podcast. And there's, early on, a friend was saying, listen, do you think you're going too fast on this? Because maybe you're going to run out of people or topics. And trust me, the deeper you go, the more there is to learn. So yeah, it's been a real wonderful journey, and it was a pleasure having you on a couple months ago.
Well, my experience on the podcast is the same, is that I like talking to people. I always have, and learning about their worlds. And, I think I got it from my dad, who was an insurance salesman and never met a stranger, right? He just, he loved people, loved a good joke. So let me just, we've been talking about an hour, so I don't want to keep you too much longer, but nuclear in the United States is stuck. I mean, we have the prospect of SMRs coming, and you have a number of companies in Canada as well that are developing SMRs, and they're promising out. I'm all for it. But do you ever despair about this? I mean, because we see these plants closing in the United States, Byron and Dresden, the Indian Point Unit 3 closing this year, which should not happen. I mean, these plants should be kept open, but of course, we've heard nothing. Alas, I say, of course, alas, we've heard nothing from the Biden administration about actually keeping them open. So, and you've mentioned the closure of Pickering. So, I mean, I'm an optimist, and how do you stay optimistic? I guess is the question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a bit of a hopeless optimist. I've always liked backing an underdog, and I try not to let I think I'm a realist as well. And again, part of it is just this fascination and curiosity, and chasing the truth down. There's a satisfaction in that in and of itself, and even the smallest advance, I think, needs to be celebrated. I think, again, there's just so much room for this discourse to develop once people have the courage to actually engage with the issues and not sort of be, I don't want to say canceled per se, but really, I mean, it's very hard to get a pro-nuclear narrative into the mainstream media. I mean, we recently at Canadians for Nuclear Energy challenged our national broadcaster, who said, this is the 10th anniversary of the earthquake, which caused the meltdown, which released radiation, which killed 20,000 people. We called them on that, and the ombudsman sort of shamefacedly said, well, you're right. I mean, strictly speaking, everything we said was true. It's just we should have rearranged the sentence. It's totally disingenuous, but it's tough. I mean, I've had conversations I never thought I would have had. I mean, I'm talking to the shadow natural resource critic, talking to many political figures these days, because I think there is this understanding that nuclear is essential for meeting, these ambitious climate goals that we've set out for ourselves. The issue is that, and I think this speaks to what we were talking about before with, do we pursue this in a privatized fashion? The lack of government support for the freight train of nuclear is going to cripple it potentially. And I think that's why we're sort of trying to appease a liberalized electricity market by being really maybe humble in our aspirations and saying, okay, well, maybe we should start the whole process over. Because I mean, let's not forget, the nuclear industry started by building micro reactors and small modular reactors, and economies of scale have won out. It's a very untested idea that, SMRs and an economy of multiples are going to be able to trump economies of scale. But I think the idea is, well, let's do it because that's the only hope we have for ever building anything new again.
Right.
And for me, I think I've always, wanted to challenge foundational ideas. And I think that's something we need to do. And we need to give governments the political cover to realize that there are grassroots citizens who care about this issue, who are educated, who are energy literate, and want to follow the evidence base, which again demonstrates that nuclear has a proven track record of adding the most megawatts of ultra low carbon energy per time unit. France decarbonized, right? Sweden decarbonized, Ontario decarbonized. You can't point a jurisdiction to me that's not part of a larger grid that's decarbonized with renewables. So yeah, there's work to be done, Robert. But I guess I'm just kind of energetic, and I don't mind a Sisyphean task. I don't mind pushing the boulder up the hill.
Well, good. Well, maybe we should end there, Chris, because we're right about an hour, but I'm glad that you're up for the Sisyphean tasks ahead. My guest has been Chris Keefer. He's the director of Doctors for Nuclear Energy. They're on doctorsfornuclearenergy.org. He also has he's the host of the Decouple Podcast, which you can find on all the podcast outlets. And he's also, you're involved with Canadians for Nuclear Energy. Are you a director there as well? What's your
Presidente?
Presidente. Presidente of Canadians for Nuclear Energy. So I'm sure if you use the Google, you can find Dr. Chris Keefer, who is also a physician and emergency room doctor. So, Chris, thanks a million for being on the podcast. It's been a great conversation. And I'm glad we were able to find another time to talk at length.
It's been a lot of fun, and it's great being a part of this really, I think, budding ecosystem. I think our podcast started around the same time, and there's just a number of great podcasts that are coming out that give me a lot of hope, and I think that are really enriching the debate.
Yeah, and like you, the number of guests, I got a long list of people I want to talk to, and so it's been it's a lot of work, but it's also a lot of fun. So again, Chris Keefer, thanks a million. Thanks to all you in podcast land for tuning in today. Tune into the next episode of the Power Hungry podcast with another guest that may be as interesting as Chris Keefer. We will find out. So, okay, thanks. See y'all next time.
Cheers, Robert.